Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our movie review podcast, Cinemacast, right here on YouTube and on Rumble. If you guys have yet to do so, if you guys enjoy our content on these channels, please hit the like, subscribe, and follow down below if you guys enjoy our content on these channels. Also, if you're watching us on YouTube, links to our social media and other platforms are down below in the description section below. You guys want to follow us over there. So, before we talk about today's feature, which is, yes, it is titled I Know What You Did Last Summer, this is the 2025 sequel to the movie that came out back in 1997 or 98, I believe, if my memory strikes me correctly. Yes, 1997, I'm sorry. Let's take a look at the last 30 to 40 years of the 1900s. You know, the 1900s was the pinnacle age of cinema. You know, we had a lot of golden movies. We had a lot of movies that were stinkers, a lot of them that were great, Oscar-worthy or Razzie-worthy or whatever. When it came to horror, there was all kind of different subgenres to horror within the last 50 years. You had movies from the paranormal. You've had movies where creature features, monster movies, the boogeyman, such. You had psychological thriller, psychological horror movies. You had a slew of different movies that knew how to scare you just the right way. Especially in the 1960s, going into the 70s. Especially 1960 alone, you had Alfred Hitchcock that pretty much started the whole slasher genre, to say, was Psycho. Psycho was a psychological horror movie, and of course it's considered a slasher at the time. And you know, good old Alfred Hitchcock, you know, he was like the master, well, I wouldn't say the master of horror, he's like the master of suspense. Anything that came out Alfred Hitchcock, he can really tell a good story, you know, he really could. He could put you on the edge of your seat in suspense. Whether it be a good thriller or a good horror, whatever. Psycho was one of those first early movies that came out to be considered the Kickstarter of the slasher genre. And of course, you had other movies that followed. You know, you had Hammer horror, which included, you know, Dracula films, Frankenstein films, you know, the creature features, you know, that may be considered a slasher. But you know, what is considered a slasher movie, right? What's considered a slasher? It's usually a movie with a body count, right? This is something that was explained in movies like Scream from 1990s. And that was a movie that was directed brilliantly and created by Wes Craven, the late, great Wes Craven, who gave us movies like The Hills Have Eyes, The People Under the Stairs, Nightmare on Elm Street, and many, many others. But you gotta figure, like, several movies came out within the 1960s and the 70s, you know? You had movies that even redefined the genre. Movies like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Last House on the Left. And then, of course, you have movies like Halloween, which came out in 1978, which redefined redefined the slasher genre. I was about to say Psycho. I don't know why I had Psycho going on. But yeah, redefined the slasher genre, brought it more to the mainstream, to a more broader audience, especially how it was released. It was released in theaters, it was released on TV, it was released, I believe, around the Halloween season, like Halloween night, you know, that's what John Carpenter said, you know, it was like, let's release it on Halloween night, you know, the movie's called Halloween. And there's a big story behind the scenes of, you know, when Halloween was created, when it was thought of, and when it was written, you know. But that was like one of the biggest movies that kind of brought it to a broader audience, a more mainstream audience. But, you know, before then, you had movies like Psycho, you had Black Christmas, you had The Hills Have Eyes, Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All of them were slasher horror movies. And of course, Halloween's the biggest one of all that brought it more to the mainstream, blew the genre wide open for many other imitators, many other different movies to come out, like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and many other B movies that came out in the 80s and even in the 90s. But you gotta think, like, in the 90s, the genre was kind of dying off in a sense, a little bit, just a little bit, because it felt like it was being overdone too much in the 80s. You know, everybody was looking for the next big slasher movie, you know, like who done it, you know, who's the killer in this one. You know, you had movies like the Slumber Party Massacre. You got a guy running around with this big ass construction drill killing off these teenage girls, stalking them and shit. It's there were so many great movies that came out in the 80s, and of course it was just like getting real stale in the 90s. In the 90s they experimented with a lot of different types of horror, and especially around, you know, the slasher genre was just pretty much dying off. But then it was pretty much reinvented again in 1996 when Wes Craven came out with Scream. And by then, you know, Scream was a sensation amongst the younger crowd. Everybody was happy to see something fresh and something new, something a little bit different. And of course, they said that, you know, because of movies like Scream, everybody, that's when the caller ID was invented. Because up until then, anybody could have called you. You didn't know who they were. You didn't know what number they called from. You just star 69 that shit, you know. But nowadays, because of movies like that, everybody had a caller ID, and it really popularized people. It's incredible how a horror movie like that can really affect the general public in a sense, really scare you to be like, oh, what if it does happen? Something like that could happen. You know, you have a ton of psychos out there that can do shit like that, you know? They can look your name up in the phone book. Oh, for your younger kids out there, a phone book is a book full of phone numbers, depending on where they're located at. If it's in Maryland, if it's Virginia, if it's within the city limits, and you've got thousands of names in there in alphabetical order, and you can look people up by phone numbers. That's what you did back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, of course. You don't really see that much today. You know, you could just pretty much find anybody on social media, or you could just look them up online, that kind of thing. But back to what I was saying, you know, movies like Scream redefined the genre. It brought new life back into it. And then, of course, you got another slew of movies to come out, of course, that were all slasher related. And of course, one of them was 1997's I Know What You Did Last Summer, which of course starred Jennifer Love Hewitt, Sarah Michelle Gellar, and of course Freddie Prinze Jr. And this was one of those movies that, you know, it's like, who done it? What happened? You know? And it was about a group of teenagers that were out one night joyriding, getting drunk, having fun, and of course they end up hitting somebody in the road, running them over, and what do? They just end up taking the body out to shore and wash him out in the sea. I think, if my memory recollects it, I think that's how it happened. I can't remember. It's been a long time, but yeah, it was about, you know, these kids covering up a car accident where they supposedly killed a man, and then of course 1 year later, on the date of the anniversary, they all received these notes. I know what you did last summer. And of course, one by one, each one of these kids, they're getting killed off by this mysterious killer who's in a rain slicker and dons a hook, a fisherman's hook for his weapon, or her weapon in that case. And this is when the slasher genre was well into it. You know, these slasher movies, you know, they were full of suspense. Teenagers in the late 90s, you know, they were on the edge of their seats. They were screaming at the screen. Don't go in there. Don't go in there. You're so stupid. Don't do that. Why would you do that? You know, it was so fun. It was a fun theater going experience for a lot of teenagers, a lot of people that love the genre, and it just breathed new light into the genre. And then, of course, you had the sequel, which came out a year later. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. Most of the same characters, some new characters, this time a different setting. This time, you still got the same killer, but this time, you know, his hand's cut off. He has a hook that's embedded in his hand, you know, and it's just so much more to it than that. And then, of course, there was a direct-to-video sequel to him, I guess. It was like they call it a supernatural slasher. I didn't even really see it. It was like, I'll always know what you did last summer. I didn't see it. It's directed to the video, but I imagine it's not that great anyway to begin with. But then, the slasher genre, a lot of the different horror genres seems to kind of stale out over time. And what have we had for the last 20, 25 years? We've had a very few little creature features, but most of them were all supernatural related. We've had a big slew. Like I said, 20 years in the making, we've had horror movies that were all supernatural related, whether it was paranormal related or something that was cursed or something that, just comes to life, anything like that. Everywhere you look, it was some kind of ghost story. Just like for the last 15 years, you had the Conjuring series, which is all based off of the Ed and Lorraine Warren hauntings and their investigations into these hauntings and such, like the Annabelle doll and all that. But then again, it's like those were the kind of movies right there. It's like, the horror genre is not really taking off or going in a particular way that they wanted to. And of course, because what was the biggest blockbuster genre of them all within the last 20 years almost? The Marvel Cinematic Universe. You had Spider-Man, Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, all these movies. The cinematic universe for Marvel was kicking off. Everybody was all in for Marvel. Everybody was all in for DC. Who's going to be the next Superman? Who's going to be the next Batman and such? But then, here it is, 2025. The last couple of years have been pretty good for the horror genre. And then, of course, within the last 10 years, you had Hollywood, you had all these directors, you had all these screenwriters that are like, let's go back to some original material. And of course, you got David Gordon Green, who did the Halloween trilogy, which is a direct sequel to Halloween 78, and in my opinion, is complete garbage. 2018, Halloween Kills, Halloween Ends. It shouldn't even exist. It shouldn't even exist at all. That makes Rob Zombie's Halloween look like a fucking masterpiece, basically. But then you got other movies that follow suit too, as well. Especially Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where you bring back original, movies like that, movies like Exorcist, anything that has an original idea from the 70s or 80s. You're bringing back original characters that are old as hell, just for like a cameo appearance in some way, or maybe they fit into the story somehow. And that just seems to be like the new idea right here. It's like you take an idea from 30, 40 years ago and you build around it or you build upon it and you make it a continuation, right? Same thing with Halloween 2018 up through Halloween Ends. You bring back Jamie Lee Curtis. You bring back old characters from the first two Halloween movies. It's like, what are you bringing them back for? I don't know if Hollywood is trying to get the attention of newer horror fans, the Gen Z horror fans, the kids that are in school and high school and all. Maybe they're trying to catch their attention with these newer films to having a more appreciation for the older films, maybe. I don't know. Everybody's attention span is much, much different. I still go for the older stuff myself. That's what I grew up on. But you got a movie right here. I Know What You Did Last Summer. And yes, it is titled just like the 1997 movie. And it's been almost 30 years. Almost 30 years for now this franchise. And of course, this movie does bring back Jennifer Love Hewitt and Freddie Prinze Jr. And it brings them back in a very peculiar way. And of course, I'm even on the borderline of saying, do I want to spoil it for you guys or not? But since I'm in a generous mood to give you a review right here, right now, I am not going to spoil it for you. I usually put spoilers in my reviews, but I'm not going to do that because I know you guys are going to want to see this movie indefinitely. So here we are. I Know What You Did Last Summer. 2025 American slasher film directed by Jennifer Caitlin Robinson. That name does not ring a bell, but let's see. What is she known for? Some shit that I don't even fucking know. I never heard of movies like Someone Great, Unpregnant. Oh, she wrote Thor: Love and Thunder. Let me tell you something about Thor: Love and Thunder. I actually love the story of that movie. I thought it was pretty cool. Not a lot of people thought it was great. A lot of people thought, the story for it was kind of, watered down for that movie. I actually did enjoy it. I enjoyed it a good bit. It kind of felt like it was its own entity in a sense, but yeah, you figure a female wrote the script, so that's probably why it failed for a lot of people. But other than that, these two movies are the only ones that I've seen from her, is Thor and I Know What You Did Last Summer. And of course, she wrote an episode for the show Sweet Vicious, I guess. Never heard of it. And she directed Love Life. Okay, only one episode of that. Other than that, yeah, this is pretty much somebody that I don't even know who the hell it is, but all right. So this movie is the fourth installment to the franchise, and it is a direct sequel to I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. And this has a slew of new actors and actresses in the movie, such as Madeline Klein, Chase Swee Wanders, Jonah Howard King, Tyreek Withers, and we even got somebody in here that's so when I went and saw this film and they showed Billy Campbell or William Campbell in the credits, and I'm like, why does that name sound so familiar? And it's like, he looks oddly familiar to me, Billy Campbell, and I had to look him up. I was like, oh my God, I've seen him in a few movies. And if you're old school like me, you probably recognize him from a movie that came out in the early 90s, which was Disney's The Rocket Man. Not Rocket Man, The Rocketeer. I'm sorry. He was in the movie The Rocketeer. He was the guy that donned the suit and the jetpack in The Rocketeer. That's Billy Campbell. So, yeah, he is in this movie as well. And, of course, there is one other person that does, well, there's two other people that appear in this film. I'm not gonna name. You guys just have to watch and wait for them as appearing as cameos. So the plot of the movie takes place 27 years after the Tower Bay murders, when another hook-wielding killer appears and kills. A killer appears and begins targeting a group of friends 1 year after they covered up a car crash in which they supposedly killed someone. And of course, plans for the fourth film in the franchise, it did begin back in 2014. Over 10 years ago, the plan for the fourth film started in 2014 when Mike Flanagan and Jeff Howard signed on to write a reboot with no connection to the previous installments. And I remember seeing that it was going to be something that was going to be a little bit more different, especially since they came out with I think they came out with a TV series, I believe it was. Let me look back on that. Yeah, there was a TV series that came out in 2021, and it seems like the series was based on the 1973 novel of the same name. This was, it was on Amazon Prime. Okay, so there was a series. I didn't pay much attention to the series, though. Usually, if you base a series off a movie like this, I'm not going to fucking watch it, of course. I think it's going to be garbage, actually. However, this version ultimately fell through following the cancellation of the 2021 television series adaptation. I guess it didn't last very long. The project was relaunched when Robinson pitched her version to Sony Pictures. The film was put into early development in February 2023. And of course, this is when you have Neil H. Moritz? Yeah, Moritz, who was the producer. He was returning. And of course, Freddie Prinze Jr. and Jennifer Love Hewitt were also confirmed to be returning in 2024, with new cast members joining throughout the year. So what is this movie based about? Well, I feel like, in a way, it's kind of a spiritual sequel. It has almost the similar thing, almost some of the similar effects that the original has. It's almost like a well, let's see. If you've seen movies like Minority Report, I would call them an echo. It's like a familiar echo back to the very first movie, certain scenes that do pick up, of course. You know, you got a group of teens that are out having fun, you know, and of course, they end up accidentally, something happens, and it involves another person. Almost in a similar way, the person ends up dying off, and this time around, they're like, okay, let's call the police and have the police come out here. Okay, they did, but instead of reporting it to the police, they decide, no, we're just going to drive home, act like nothing happened, this never happened, we're just going to live our lives, you know, in peace and not talk about this again. And of course, you know, you fast forward to 1 year later, there's an event going on, and of course, one of the girls ends up getting a card that says, I know what you did last summer. And of course, the town that they live in, or that it's based off of, they all know the story about what happened back in 1997. So now they're on the hunt to find Julie, who was played by HEWITT, and of course find Ray, who's played by Freddie Prinze Jr., and go into the background details as to what to expect from a mysterious killer who's sending them a mysterious note. And then they ask, okay, let me ask you a question. What did you do last summer? And it's just like a bunch of flashbacks for them. And it's horrific, of course. You know, they're like, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about it. But it's like, well, guess what? The murders are repeating. Only this time, it just seems like it starts out where it's like, it's not them being killed off. It's people close to them that are being killed off before they are killed off eventually, one by one. And let me tell you, this murder mystery of who done it or who's doing it, this was a roller coaster of a ride, trying to figure out who the killer actually is. And just watching it, I had my suspicions on at least 2, maybe 3 possible characters that might have fit the description or might have fit the detail of what we're looking for. And it turns out I was completely wrong. And I'm sure you guys will be completely wrong too, because it is a complete twist toward the end. And that is what this movie delivers on very, very well. Not just the suspense that it brings back to not just a newer audience, but the original audience from 1997. Here I am, 39 years old, and I feel like I'm watching the original all over again. It's a whole new cast, and of course, some of the kills are a little bit more different, maybe not as grotesque as they were in the original movies, but let me tell you, it's almost like I said, it's like an echo. It's like deja vu for certain scenes in this movie, where it almost feels like not was copied from the original, but done in a most particular way. And it does it so cleverly, so subtly. But then, like I said, when you find out who the killer really is, you are not just only on the edge of your seat for this twist, you are in a big shock all. Like, you're in for a big shock. And especially when you think it ends too soon, which I thought it would. When you find out who the killer was, you thought it was ending really too soon. But there was a lot more to it. It was done really clever. And I think the way it was done, it's just like, I don't want to say a big slap in the face to a lot of fans of this movie, but I think I can respect the way this script was written. I respect the way that they chose the killer for this movie and why they must have did it. And it just feels so brilliant. It feels so brilliant. There's a reason behind as to why they did it. And it was so satisfying. It was really satisfying to see that. And of course, you know, the very, very ending of the movie, I think it could have ended a little bit less cringy. I mean, this movie kind of ended a little cringy, where it was like, oh, we still got to do this kind of thing, you know, just that kind of thing with the ending. And I just feel like, okay, they are subtly setting it up for a sequel. Of course. Of course. Like, they put all their money in the basket for this movie to have a sequel. You know, a movie that's on an $18 million budget, and so far it just brought in $27 million. It made its money back and then some. Now, however, I will say the critics were a little bit harsh on this movie, especially websites like RottenTomatoes.com, and you guys know how I feel about Rotten Tomatoes, giving this movie a 38% out of 147 critics' reviews that are positive. The website's consensus reads, faithfully hearkening back to the original for better or for worse, this I Know What You Did Last Summer reboot serves up plenty of nostalgia without even finding a compelling hook of its own. See, there's a problem with that statement. They say it's a reboot. It's not really a reboot, though. It's a sequel. There's nothing rebooted about this film. Yes, there are repeats that it feels like it's from the original, or like they said, faithfully hearkening back to the original for better or for worse. Yes, there are some scenes that make it feel that you feel the nostalgia a little bit. It feels like you're going back in time a little bit. Yes, there are some scenes in there I felt this movie could have probably done without certain scenes. And like I said, I'm not spoiling it for you guys, but let me just say, for me personally, there are certain scenes I felt like this movie kind of overdid it a little bit, stepping over the boundaries with. They could have done without it. Instead, they could have added something else differently to the story a little bit, or just done without certain scenes that may have saved it an extra 30 seconds or a couple minutes, even if so, that wasn't even really needed to begin with. So I think that is one flaw that this movie has, I feel, is they added certain things to the elements of the story that just felt out of place for a movie like this. It felt so out of place, and I'm like, yeah, this is kind of going to turn some heads a little bit, you know, like very tongue-in-cheek wise. But other than that, everybody was just so pumped to, you know, hope and pray that their favorite character amongst this group makes it out alive, or maybe they know that this person's going to end up dead for something stupid they did or said or whatever. And yes, there is some comedic relief in the movie, of course. You know, any horror movie out there, any slasher movie, there's going to be some kind of comedic relief in there where the audience is going to laugh a little bit, you know, especially the old school fans. They're going to laugh a little bit with this movie. But like I said, there's just certain things about it that this movie could have really done without, that they really should have wrote out of the story, all in general. And then, of course, you got Allison Foreman of IndieWire giving the film a B plus, and wrote that it's lean, mean serial killer flick. Entertainment Weekly's Jordan Hoffman gave it a B minus and wrote, clever moments and a sensational performance from Madeline Klein keep the movie mostly alive. And then you got Brian Tallarico of RogerEbert.com. They're like the fucking Democrats of Hollywood critics. Gave it a 1 out of 4 stars. Yeah, of course. Saying that the overall shallowness of I Know What You Did Last Summer would be fine if it were just better made. In particular, the editing by Saria Hader is just off rhythm. It's like a car in the wrong gear going in the right direction, but something's wrong with the speed. The kill scenes are particularly inconsistent, as the first couple strikes are a tone are gory fun, but the back half of the film plays out like a more serious fare. I guess I can favor in that a little bit. Yes, if you're a gore hound for movies like this, it's not going to be too gory, but I think a good story will rely more on suspense than it will rely on the kills or the gore. And of course, yes, at some points it did feel like this movie was kind of going in an odd direction for some. especially in certain scenes where I feel like somebody could have died or should have died, but didn't, and they just wait until like another scene or something. Yeah, so yeah, there is probably a couple different spots in this movie that just kind of feels a little bit off to to a lot of people for the most part. I think what got a much positive vibe out of this film was mostly the nostalgia for Freddie Prinze Jr. and Jennifer Love Hewitt making their return, not just as cameo characters, but as important characters to the story as well. And I think it did a fine job with bringing them both in and adding them both to the story, even though it kind of felt a little lackluster, especially for Hewitt's part, just adding her in there. But Freddie Prinze Jr., he had a more prominent part, even though I feel like there was one scene with him in it that just felt so very cringeworthy, and they could have wrote his character a little bit more top notch. Like he sounded like a little whiny bitch in a couple scenes, but I feel like they could have wrote his character a little bit more better. But I don't think that was noticed very much by a lot of diehard fans. Because let me tell you, by the end of this movie, by the time the credits rolled, everybody in the theater where I was at were applauding and cheering for this entry. Now, I will say, if you do see this movie, guys, stay for the post-credit scene. Or maybe not, I guess it's, no, the pre-credit scene, I'm sorry. So there is it's either pre-credit or mid-credit. I forgot what they call it, but yes. Oh, they call it a post-credit scene. Okay. There's a post-credit scene, so stay tuned for that before the main credits roll. There is an extra scene that you guys will want to stay by for. And, of course, a lot of you diehard fans will know who's going to be in that post-credit scene. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it's probably going to get a lot of people cheering more and more for what's ready to come. You know, hopefully in another sequel. Hopefully. So, but yeah, this movie, it has a lot going for it. Even though for some it may fall a little bit short. I don't want to say falls a little bit short. I think this movie kind of stumbles a few times. It really does. It stumbles over its own trench coat a couple times and falls a little short here and there. But other than that, some of the performances were done very well. It was very amazing seeing a couple of classic characters from the past reprising their roles in this film, and it did it very well. And there was a lot of diehard fans that loved it. They wanted more, and it seems like they might get a little bit more out of it. Let's hope so. And I will say, after seeing this movie, after going through it, I will say I will give this movie an honest rating of, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. I will be more generous than the critics are. The critics, they love to hate something. When there's a positive audience out there that love things like this, critics love to hate on it. They don't want people to see stuff like this. They want people to see what they want to see. And it's like, no, fuck you. You hate this movie? Guess what? I was in a theater full of people, young and old, even old school fans that were like cheering and clapping for this movie when it ended. So, yeah, never go off of what a critic says. Never read the consensus of any websites that criticize movies really harshly, because in the end, if you don't check it out for yourself, you're never going to know. And I saw this in theaters. It was worth seeing in theaters. I loved it. I give this movie a 7 out of 10. Now, did you guys go and see this movie? What did you think about it? Let me know down in the comment section what you thought about this movie. What were your favorite parts in this movie? What did you like about it? And guys, that pretty much does it for today's episode of Cinemacast. I'd like to thank you guys for stopping by today, checking out the review. Today's feature was I Know What You Did Last Summer, 2025. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button on you guys' way out after seeing this review today. And until next time, Catch you right back here at the cinema.